We've been studying different types of elasticity in this unit. Elasticities always measure the responsiveness of somebody to a change in something. In this video, we'll be talking about income elasticity of demand, sometimes abbreviated as YED. The Y being economists' chosen abbreviation for income for some reason. Let's talk about income elasticity of demand. This is a measure of the responsiveness of consumers of a good to a change in their incomes. In other words, it looks at how much the demand for a particular good will change as a result of a change in consumers' incomes. The formula for YED is going to look very familiar by this point. It measures the percentage change in the quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in consumers' incomes. Now that's different than price elasticity of demand, which measures the percentage change in quantity resulting from a percentage change in the good's price. Now, what if we do not know the percentage changes in quantity and income? Well, as with other types of elasticities, these can pretty easily be calculated. All we need is two quantities and two levels of income, and we can determine the percentage change in quantity by taking the new quantity minus the original quantity and dividing it by the original quantity. And we can calculate the percentage change in consumers' incomes by taking the new level of income and subtracting the original level of income and dividing by the original. Now also, like other types of elasticities, the midpoint formula could be used to calculate income elasticity of demand. All that would require is using, instead of the original quantity and the original income here, we would use the average quantity and the average income between Q1 and Q2 and between Y1 and Y2. This would allow us to calculate elasticity using the midpoint method. So what is income elasticity of demand really? We're looking at how much demand for a particular good will change when consumers' incomes either rise or fall. Now, not all goods are going to have the same relationship between income and demand. You may recall from an earlier unit that there are two broad categories of goods known as normal goods and goods known as inferior goods. Normal goods are those which will demonstrate a direct relationship between income and demand, and inferior goods are those which demonstrate an indirect relationship between income and demand. Now, to illustrate this, we're going to go through a couple examples here. Let's start with our first example. Let's look at the markets for public transportation, that's represented by our bus here, and private transportation, or cars, represented by the car. What we want to know is how will the demand for public transportation change as a result of a 10% decrease in consumers' income, and how will demand for cars or private transportation change as a result of the same decrease in income. Let's start with public transportation. Let's assume that as a result of the 10% decrease in incomes, the quantity demanded for public transportation, that's quantity demanded for public transportation, increases by 7%. At the same time, the quantity demanded for private transportation, so the quantity demanded for cars, decreases by 12%. We can now calculate the income elasticities of demand for public transportation and for private transportation as a result of a 10% decrease in consumers' incomes. So let's calculate the YED for public transportation first. All we need to do is plug in our percent change in quantity, that's 7%, and divide that by our percent change in incomes, which is minus 10%. Notice that it's a decrease, incomes have fallen, so we have a negative change in income. And that gives us a YED for public transportation of 7 over negative 10, that's negative 0.7. That's going to be our income elasticity of demand for public transportation. We'll come back to analyze that result in just a moment. Let's go ahead and calculate the YED for cars, for private transportation. Now, the demand for cars fell by 12%, so we're going to have a YED of negative 12% over negative 10%. That gives us a YED of 1.2 because we're now dividing a negative number by another negative number. Those negatives cancel each other out, and we get a YED of 1.2. All right, what do we have here? We have a negative YED for buses, for public transportation, and we have a positive YED for cars, private transportation. What does that tell us? That tells us that the YED for inferior goods is always going to be negative. And the YED for normal goods is always positive. The reason for this, of course, has to do with the relationship between incomes and demand for inferior goods and incomes and demand for normal goods. For inferior goods like public transportation, when incomes rise, this is going to lead to a decrease in the quantity of the good demanded. Whereas with normal goods like cars, a rise in incomes will lead to an increase in the quantity that consumers are willing and able to buy at every price. In other words, demand will increase. That inverse relationship here, this is a negative relationship, whereas the direct relationship here is a positive relationship. So the first observation in our understanding of income elasticity of demand is this point that the coefficient of the YED value will either be negative or positive. So we must pay attention to the negative signs when calculating YED, because whether YED is negative or positive tells us whether the goods in question are inferior goods or normal goods. What we haven't done yet is interpreted the absolute value of the YED coefficient. What we'll do next is talk about why a good's income elasticity of demand will be relatively inelastic or relatively elastic. And to do that, we'll put two more goods on the screen here. All right, here we have toothpaste on the top. That's the good in question. And on the bottom, we have lattes. Everybody loves a latte. What's the difference between toothpaste and lattes? Just like before, let's go through an example here. Now we're assuming that incomes rise by 10%. Let's assume that this 10% increase in income leads to a very minimal increase in the quantity demanded of toothpaste. Let's assume that the demand for toothpaste only goes up by 1%. On the other hand, let's assume that demand for lattes goes up by 15%. So we've got a 15% increase in the demand for lattes and only a 1% increase in demand for toothpaste. Well, we can go ahead and calculate the YEDs for lattes and toothpaste using these numbers and our YED equation. The YED for toothpaste is 1% divided by 10%. That's a very inelastic response among consumers to their higher incomes. That gives us a YED of only 0.1. If we calculate the YED for lattes, on the other hand, we get the following. The 15% increase in demand for lattes results from a 10% increase in consumers' incomes, giving us a YED coefficient of 1.5. Now, the first thing to observe, of course, is that both of these are normal goods. Normal goods, how do we know that? Because they're both positive. There's a direct relationship between incomes and demand for toothpaste, and there's a direct relationship between incomes and demand for lattes. But why might demand for lattes be so much more income elastic than demand for toothpaste? Well, the main difference here is that toothpaste is a necessity. It's something that consumers are going to buy in relatively fixed quantities regardless of how their incomes rise or fall. So that 10% increase in income, consumers are not going to rush to the stores and start buying a ton more toothpaste. Rather, they're going to be highly unresponsive to their higher incomes in terms of how much toothpaste they actually buy. On the other hand, lattes, these are kind of a luxury. These are things that you can definitely live without. We could easily have black coffee at home. We could have instant coffee. Going to a coffee shop and buying a latte is something that we definitely can do without. Most consumers will tend to be more responsive in their demand for luxuries when their incomes change than they would in their demand for necessities. So for luxury goods, such as lattes and other things we don't necessarily need but are nice to have, we tend to have a more elastic response to income changes. So one observation here is that demand for necessities tends to be relatively income inelastic, whereas demand for luxury goods tends to be relatively income elastic. Notice my use of terminology here. I'm not saying that demand for necessities is inelastic. That would imply the price elasticity of demand is inelastic. Rather, I'm saying demand for necessities is income inelastic and demand for luxuries is income elastic. It's important that you use the right terminology when describing income elasticity of demand. Demand for a good can be income elastic or income inelastic. Additionally, when talking about the value of the income elasticity demand coefficient, we need to recognize that inferior goods will have a negative YED because of the inverse relationship and the negative relationship between consumers' incomes and the quantity that people buy, whereas demand for normal goods like private transportation will have a positive YED coefficient due to the direct relationship, that positive relationship between consumers' incomes and the quantities that they wish to buy.